little Bo Peep has lost her sheep. I can't tell where to find it. Go! Leave them alone and they'll come home. I'm bringing their tails behind them.
Hi, my name is Tamara Laschek, and you're listening to the Bo Peep podcast, where men are women, women are men, and the sheep are confused. Now let's see if we can make sense of this crazy world. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the program. I am thrilled to have the author of the book Putin's Playbook on with me today. Welcome, Rebekah.
Thank you very much, Tamara. I'm so happy to be here with you and your audience.
Yes, very interesting book. I've recently read it, so I'm super excited to dive in. But let me just give a little bit of your background, and you could fill in anything that I missed. I mean, generally speaking, you were a very senior ranking intelligence officer in our DIA, and you were an expert on things Russia and even KGB, I would say. So, I mean, I don't know if we need to say any more, but you were truly an expert on this topic.
For those who don't know what DIA is, DIA stands for the Defense Intelligence Agency, and it's Central Intelligence Agency's military counterpart. In other words, we do the real work. We actually support the U.S. warfighter by providing critical intelligence to help them win wars, or more importantly, prevent wars.
Yes. And so let me ask you some questions about your background, because you were born in the former Soviet Union. So give us a quick summary of your life and how you got to be an intelligence officer in the US, intelligence agencies.
Sure. I was born and raised in the former Soviet Union. As you said, and my parents were anti-communists. They didn't love the socialist communist system, and for whatever reason, they raised me to love America, and especially my mom. She kind of raised me with the idea that eventually I would go to America. I have no idea how she knew. She's never been to America. At least, until I got here. She visited me once, but she basically thought that the country is the land of freedom and opportunity, and she encouraged me to learn English, and I did, and I went to university in Moscow, learning English. Lo and behold, in 1989, I ended up being in America thanks to my American friends who were big Reaganites. They were from Georgia and Alabama. I originally basically started off in the private sector, in the international business and in information technology. But then after the September 11th terrorist attacks, I wanted to go and serve my adopted homeland by becoming an intelligence officer. And I started pursuing this career. At that point, former President George Bush called on first-generation Americans to provide our expertise and knowledge of foreign cultures. And so I started the long journey trying to become an intelligence officer. And it took a while, but I did it. And I served proudly. That was the best job ever. And now I'm on my own. I'm an independent consultant, helping people figure out all things Russia, China, Iran. There are a lot of threats that our homeland faces. And I'd like to help mitigate those threats and prevent them from metastasizing into wars like the endless war that we are in right now.
Right. And in reading your book, I would like to note that your passion for your job and for America really comes through. So, and it reminds me a little bit of me and my career on Wall Street. When I started, I was so blessed to have the job that, I came in, I was the first one in the office. I was the one to put my hand up, always working holidays and weekends, and loved my job and just lived and breathed it. And you can feel that same passion and devotion for the job when you write about it in your book. So I have to say that does come through.
Well, Tamara, if you don't mind, let me break the podcast protocol and actually ask you a question, because I'm actually curious on Wall Street. Did your boss ever tell you, Tamara, you're working a little too hard. You should stop working too hard because others cannot compete with you. Did that ever happen?
That doesn't actually happen on Wall Street. I think that's exclusive to government jobs. On Wall Street, they're happy to suck every bit of blood, sweat, and tears out of you. So remember, it's the epitome of capitalism. So they will let you work. If you want to come in working weekends, yes, occasionally you may get a boss who might be concerned that you're burning out or something, but it's pretty rare. It's pretty rare.
Yes, I can see that, because my first career, as I said, was in the private sector. So I was stunned when some of the government apparatchiks, I call them, the US version of nomenclatura and the KGB, they were basically telling me, oh, you work too hard, you have to let all of these other people compete with you and do the briefings. It doesn't matter whether they have expertise or not, but everybody has to be equal, right? That's the new mantra in our country, equality of outcome and socialism that frightens the heck out of me.
Yes, and we'll get into that a little bit more deeply as we go on with some of the questions, because I know that that's even a strategy of Putin's. So let me start out with a very basic question. Who is Vladimir Putin?
Vladimir Putin is a classic former, with former being in quotes, KGB operative. And he is a typical Soviet type apparatchik. And he served in intelligence, and to the core, he is a spy. What does it mean? These special breed of people, they were basically trained to, quote unquote, protect Mother Russia from all threats, foreign and domestic. And so he took it to heart. Being an intelligence operative is part of his identity, which means that he lies when he has to lie. He does anything, including, assassinate innocent people, such as journalists, such as his political opponents. He destroys, a country like Ukraine, targeting civilians, all to achieve a very, very specific goal. And so to treat him as someone, like a regular politician, like any other, let's say Western leader, is a mistake. And this is what I've been trying to warn when I was an intelligence officer, not to make a mistake, not to believe all these various psychological operations, which is what they were, including the one that the Russians targeted former President George Bush was. Remember, he was wearing a cross, and, Bush ended up looking into his eyes, and he saw, a perfect, innocent man and a soul and all these sorts of things. So it's a mistake to underestimate Putin. And we haven't even seen all the atrocity, believe it or not, that Putin is capable of. That is all coming in 2023, and we need to be very cognizant of that.
Yes. Well, I think that you sounding the alarm came through also very loud and clear. And one message that I took away from your book, which is why this is such an important book for everyone to read, is because the Cold War is not over. We think it might be over, and Americans, go to sleep at night thinking that that is part of our, forgotten past, but it is truly not over. And Putin is absolutely fighting a war with us that we aren't even aware of.
And in fact, I would add to this, Tamara, it's an excellent observation that you've just made, but I think the Cold War is it's a two-theater war right now. We have two main adversaries, not just Russia, but we have China. And those two are colluding with each other to basically challenge the United States and the world order that the United States has created. And unfortunately, some of the Washington establishment's policies that have been pursued for decades now, not just like a year or two, they have imperiled our security and they've made our country less safe, because what we have today is all of the dictatorships, and especially it has exacerbated during the Biden administration. So what we have today is all of the dictatorships are uniting together. We've got Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, you name it. I would throw in, Saudi Arabia, which is a traditional U.S. ally, but the Biden administration has alienated them. And so all of these people combining their forces and their geopolitical capital, and often during this war, even their military hardware. And that presents an existential threat to our country that no one is noticing right now within the Biden administration, because they're so tunnel vision on this Russia-Ukraine thing that they completely have forgotten the big picture and what's going on with the country and our ability to deter threats or to fight against those threats if need be.
Yeah. And what do you think is Putin's ultimate ambition?
His ambition is very clear. He has stated about it, he's written about it. And I want to point out that it's not just Putin's ambition, he's the messenger, but this is the ambition of the entire Kremlin apparatus. And it has been for many years. His ambition is to reconstitute what the Russians call the strategic buffer or the strategic security perimeter, which is essentially the former Soviet states. He wants to reconstitute the supranational union, not unlike the former USSR, but without having those exact geographic borders. He wants geopolitical and economic control of those countries, minus the Baltic states. So it's very important to understand that Putin is not planning to invade, Poland or any other country, right? And think about it, because this is the mantra that right now the Washington establishment, so-called experts, wanting us to believe, right? That if we don't stop providing the superior military hardware to Ukraine, and if we don't help Ukraine win, which is an unachievable goal in itself, then Putin will go further. But think about this. The spectacular tactical incompetence that Russian military has exhibited in the conventional conflict, right? How in the world do we think that Putin would go after Poland, which would invoke Article 5, collective defense, or even like Finland and Sweden? This is all nonsense. This is wrong analysis and disinformation waged by the Washington establishment. So Putin's ultimate goal is to reconstitute the strategic buffer. It's sort of our Monroe Doctrine. Mm-hmm. Very, very simple.
Yeah. Yeah. And for those who don't know what the Monroe Doctrine is, that is sort of like the red line or the line in the sand that we drew about Western expansion.
Right. Just like we did not allow, the Soviets to continue to stage permanently their nuclear weapons during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. Remember, we were planning to go to war over that to prevent that from happening. Well, it's the same thing with Putin, because Russia believes that NATO and the United States are adversary number one. Why? It's because every single time NATO absorbed a former Soviet state, we introduced NATO forces, military hardware onto their territory. And so Putin is concerned about the same happening in Ukraine. So what happened today with the absorption of the Baltics into NATO, the distance between Moscow, the capital of Russia, and St. Petersburg, the second largest city, has reduced from 1,000 and 1,300 miles, respectively, between those cities and the nearest NATO territory. It has reduced to 100 miles and 300 miles, respectively, right? This is less distance than between Washington and New York. Think about that. Would we want Russia or China as close as New York, right? Would we not want to protect the capital? And so this is not to justify what Putin is doing. Absolutely not. I mean, Putin deserves to burn in hell, and he will, but I'm just explaining here the geopolitics and the real politic. And this is a very, very rough business. And so that's what Putin is doing. And he would do everything, including, ratcheting up this conflict all into the nuclear realm, if he has to. I'm just explaining why he perceives this war and the outcome as existential for him. And that's what we're dealing with.
Mm-hmm. Does Putin fear the US?
Absolutely. He is frightened. So the Russians are very realistic about their own capabilities, or lack thereof, if you will. So approximately more than, let's just say, a decade ago, the Russians have concluded, based on long-term forecasting, strategic intelligence forecasting, something that we don't do in our intelligence anymore because we're so focused on tactical brilliance. So they have concluded that a war between Russia and the US is inevitable, and that Russia is conventionally inferior to the US and it would lose the war. And therefore, they started modernizing their military and developing all these other strategies that are not conventionally focused. Mm-hmm. They're focused on nuclear, they're focused on cyber, they're focused on space warfare, in order to not just win this war, but to defeat the United States. They're not proactively seeking to invade the US, none of that. But what they want to do is prevent the US from controlling places like Ukraine. And if Putin is afraid of one thing right now, he is afraid of the Biden administration deploying forces into the theater. And to prevent that from happening, he would escalate to deter us, to show that he will go nuclear to prevent that from happening.
Wow. So you talked a little bit about China and Russia, and it seems that both China and Russia have a very similar strategy to take down the US. They're both using, something called unrestricted warfare. And you mentioned the principles of Sun Tzu several times in your book. We hear that all the time with Chinese generals as well. In fact, I think the book Unrestricted Warfare was based on those principles of, defeating your enemy without ever firing a shot. Now, Russia had a systematic program of total subversion in the United States. And you mentioned Yuri Bezmenov, who talked about, the 4-point strategy to really subvert here in the US. Can you talk a little bit about that strategy and how that's been working? Because we've reached a fever pitch with that. And I feel like, while Rezmanov talked about it 20 years ago, that the strategy was working beautifully, but I think it's really, moved ahead exponentially over the last several years. So what is it, and where are we with that?
I agree. Yes, if Yuri Bezmenov were alive today, he would not recognize this country and how close. And even I've written an op-ed actually about this on Fox News, how my adopted homeland is reminding me of Russia I fled, and how the leftist or the US Bolsheviks are trying to turn USA into USSR 2.0. So Bezmenov was a defector. He was a KGB officer who was trained in disinformation operations, or propaganda is how the US sometimes calls it, or our military calls it psychological operation. And he was stationed in India, and he decided to defect to the West, to the US or Canada, because he saw that the Soviet system, the communist system, was basically a poisonous system, right? It was destroying an individual. It was all about state control. And he did defect. He disguised himself as a hippie because he was in India. So anyway, long story short, the CIA debriefed him, and he disclosed to us that Russia had a 4-step program that it was targeting the United States with. And the goal of that program was to transform the United States in 4 phases that would take about 20 to 30 years, the whole thing. Transform it from the free capitalist society into a socialist totalitarian country, similar to what USSR was. And it was by multiple ways. It was by subverting from within, right? They were brainwashing not only the media, but mostly the educators, right? So they were presenting the ideas of socialism, the equality, for all, the equality for outcome, the free stuff. And they were portraying capitalism as the evil system where one is oppressing, multiple people. And so this is what we have going on right now. And a bunch of these people, the educators, they went to schools, they went into universities, and those seeds, they have planted by the Soviets. They gave, flowers, as the Russians would say. And even back then, they thought, which was 30 years ago, and even back then, the Soviets thought that the system, the program, was giving tremendous progress and wonderful results from them, because America became more and more brainwashed and more favorably predisposed to socialism. And we see that today. Even the Pentagon is focused on teaching pronouns rather than combat readiness for our forces. And, the schools, we all know what the schools teach us right now. So we are on the verge of literally becoming USSR 2.0. And it's very important. And it's not just about, the important thing about that system to understand, it's not just all about the free stuff. It's about total government control. And we've seen what total government control means, whether it's COVID, whether it's censorship, right? We know that the Biden administration tried to suppress the origin of COVID information. The spy agencies are now colluding with the government, and they concocted that whole Trump-Russia collusion, which was nothing, further from the truth, and all of these things, and telling you what to think and how to behave and all of that stuff. So this is a very, very frightening situation that we're in.
And it's been very effective, especially as we've seen over the last few years.
Yes, it's because it's very gradual. Because if you think about if you talk to young people today, they favor socialism, right? They favor equality of outcome. Even Harvard, I mean, they're discriminated. It has to be like the right. The Harvard actually discriminating against one minority, the Asians, to prop up another minority. I mean, it's a circus of what's going on. But the whole idea of that system is that you brainwash the young generation to the point where they cannot make sense of reality. They have a distorted understanding of reality. I mean, look at how many genders right now the young people believe that we have, whether like in real life there are two genders. There's an end of discussion.
Yeah.
But try talking about that with a young person, and you won't get any logical argument. You'll just get emotions, and so that's where we're at.
Yes. And I understand the brainwashing of the younger generations because, essentially it's not their fault. They're being brainwashed and they're taught what they're taught. But what about people in the senior ranks of the military? People like General Milley. Are they brainwashed, or is it they're viewing this as an opportunity to expand government and their power and control? Or, why are they on board with this and why are they pushing this?
You're exactly right. You nailed it, Tamara. It's the latter. It's the opportunity to basically grab more power. Whichever party is in charge, the leaders of that party are trying to select an apparatus, a regime that is favorably predisposed to their ideology, right? If it's the Democrats, they want to appoint the individuals, whether it's to IRS that is going to deploy, agents targeting, you and me, our regular people, or DHS, Mayorkas, who are going to open the border to flood the country with illegal immigrants, including with criminals, or whether it's General Milley, who, the head of the Joint Chiefs, who actually promised a foreign adversary, China, his military counterpart, that he will give heads up to the Chinese if the US were to ever plan an incursion or some sort of action that is not favorable towards China, i.e. Taiwan. I mean, if that is not treason, then what is? But yes, these people just simply, they're careerists, and I've seen a lot of them in the DIA. There's a very good, solid core of honorable intelligence officers, not just at DIA, but at CIA and throughout the intelligence community. There are people who are focused on mission, right? And we've seen those patriots. We've seen them sacrificing themselves in order not only to protect America, but also to protect our allies. But then there's the whole, huge apparatus of, we call them, the strap hangers. They are not about the mission. They are there to advance their career and advance the permanent government's ideology, which is socialism. Because remember, the appointees are only a relatively small percentage, the political appointees. Then there's a whole GS system, right, of the permanent government, and they are the ones who were, helping conduct all of these operations targeting my former boss, General Flynn, with about whom we spoke about before this podcast. They were targeting Trump. They were targeting a lot of people who don't agree with the ideology. And that is why they are doing it. And that is why we need a person who comes in and cleans up this whole, swamp in Washington.
Right. Do you think that the intelligence community in the US understands Putin?
I don't. they think that they understand Putin, but they don't understand Putin. And here's how I know this. Remember, Putin didn't just invade Ukraine out of the blue on February 24th of last year. We have seen this coming for the past, more than 10 years, right? In fact, more than 20 years. So the very first cyber operation by the Russians targeting the United States was in the 90s. Okay, it was called Moonlight Maze. During that cyber operations, the Russians exfiltrated millions of documents, top secret documents from various government agencies, US government agencies, but also various military facilities, including weapons labs. Okay, so in the 90s, then Putin also infiltrated the sleeper agents into the United States that former President Obama expelled in 2010, right? And for 10 years, they were not only spying, but they were also getting very, very close to the elites, to the business and political elites, especially to Hillary Clinton. And this is why the FBI had to pull the plug on that operation after 10 years. So then Putin, in every strategic planning documents, the Russians have acknowledged that they view the US as the threat number one in NATO and what their plan was, right? Then in 2008, Russia invaded Georgia. Then in 2014, Russia annexed Crimea in what the Western analysts called the deployed hybrid warfare, right? There's no such thing. There's no hybrid warfare term. That's our type of strategy. The Russian strategy is called strategy of indirect action or controlled instability. So there were all these precursors and steps. And yet, during that time, first of all, in 2008, nothing happened, right? There was no punishment. And if anything, the deterrence posture, US deterrence posture, was deteriorating. The Europeans were not willing to contribute towards their own security. Only 8 countries right now out of 30 even contribute 2%, right? Then President Obama wanted to do a reset. And in fact, it's not just Obama. Every single US president attempted a reset with Putin, whereas it's impossible, right? And I have a chapter in my book that is titled, Why Can't We Be Friends? So, and this is why I'm telling you, they don't understand Putin. They don't know how to deal with them. And now they're talking about regime collapse. They're talking about, Putin being sick and this and that. And no, there is no regime collapse because Putin did not by himself invent all this. There's a whole apparatus behind them that's working for him. So this is why it's dangerous that our own intelligence services not only don't understand the adversary, they're actually doing something different from worrying about protecting this country. They are, trying to target their political opponents, like what they did with Trump, right? They're trying to concoct this collusion theory so that they can deploy this Steele dossier against the former president. Imagine how many resources were misdirected, Russia-focused resources that had to be focused on Russian military capability, but most importantly on Russia's intention. And it wasn't. They were misused and they were basically wasted.
Yeah. Wow. Let me ask you this. What did Putin interfere in the 2016 election?
Yes. But it's very important to understand what that really means, because what Russia did in 2016 and what the US spy agencies tell you it did, two big differences, as the Russians say. So here's what happened. As you remember, the Russians targeted with cyber operations both sides. They targeted the DNC and they targeted the RNC to exfiltrate specific documents that they thought that they could exploit. They didn't succeed with the RNC, with the Republican National Committee, because their cyber defenses were stronger. They successfully penetrated and broke DNC servers, and they exfiltrated documents that they thought they could exploit, and they did, targeting Hillary Clinton. But remember, they tried to do both sides. And so they wanted to portray Hillary in negative terms because they knew that if they divide the US population and polarize and really disrupt the domestic politics, they disrupt the elections. So the intervention ultimately has the goal of fomenting discord and disorder, and have people of various political beliefs be at each other's throats, right? And not just political beliefs, but also of various ethnicities. They were targeting political groups, but also like minorities. They were spewing propaganda that was anti-law enforcement and pro-law enforcement. They were targeting Trump as well as Hillary. Okay, that is a very important point to understand. The Russians don't like Trump. They fear Trump. And in fact, Putin did not invade Ukraine during Trump for a very specific reason. So election interference is a classic tradecraft by the Russians. It's to sabotage. It's not to elect a specific person, okay? Because first, they know that they are not capable of doing it. The American people elect, a US president. And that's why they didn't change a single vote. And so, but what the upper echelons of the intelligence community were lying to the American people about is that there was coordination between the Trump campaign and the Russians. And again, even the Mueller report, Mueller is no fan of former President Trump, right? They confirmed that once Trump was elected, the Russians were struggling to find some sort of, sources and some sort of interlocutors within the Trump administration so they can have meetings with them. So that is how they interfered. And in fact, they believed that this was very successful operations. And former CIA director, General Hayden, admitted this was the most successful intelligence operation in the history of intelligence operations, influence operations. And to this day, we talk about it, and half of US population still view President Trump as illegitimate, which means that the country is divided and we continue to be divided. And that only plays into the hands of Putin. Whereas like the reality is Putin feared Trump. He still fears Trump. He's afraid that Trump will run in 2024, and he wants to prevent that from happening.
Yeah. I've seen an interview with Putin where he said that he doesn't actually care who wins the US elections because although it's a different president, it's the exact same policies. And I think that was probably true until President Trump.
Trump pursued, despite, what the media will tell you, Trump pursued the most robust Russia policy since Ronald Reagan. And just to demonstrate this, it will explain to your audience why Putin did not invade Ukraine during Trump. So here are the 5 things. Trump stood up the US Space Force, which undermines Russia's space warfare doctrine. The Russians stood up their Space Force in 2001. So it took President Trump and 17 years later, right, for us to establish ours. Why Space Force? The Russians concluded that the US is completely reliant on our satellite constellations, both in peacetime and for intelligence and for our military operations, and they have developed capabilities to attack our satellites. And so the Space Forces were supposed to do that. And so President Trump understood that, and he convinced the Washington establishment apparatus that we need the Space Force to protect our satellites, but also to develop counter strategy targeting Russia. Number two, he authorized offensive cyber operations against foreign adversaries, including Russia. Number three, President Trump authorized the development of the low-yield tactical nuclear warhead for our forces. It would be sea-launched cruise missile, right? The minute that Biden came to power, he canceled that program. So the program that Trump authorized would have undermined the whole escalate to de-escalate strategy that was developed on Putin's orders, under which a low-yield tactical nuclear warhead would be detonated in the theater, such as in Ukraine. So Putin was afraid of all those things. And then number five, and it's not even the last one, but we can go forever. So number five is President Trump authorized a missile strike on the Russian mercenaries that killed 300 of them in Syria, right? And I'll just, as a bonus, I'm going to throw in another one just because I get a kick out of that one. Kaspersky software, the quote unquote antivirus Kaspersky software that Eugene Kaspersky is a former KGB officer. His software, Russian intelligence controlled software, was deployed on the US government networks. You can't make this stuff up, right? In the infinite wisdom, these bureaucrats, that just shows you that they don't understand Putin. You asked me that question. So President Trump passed the order to kick them out. Okay, it took him. The guy understood. He's a businessman. He understands Putin. He understands Xi. He understands, Kim Jong-un, the rocket man. Yeah, he's not like a polished guy, right? He's from New York. You know this type, right? You're from New York, Tamara.
I know 25 Donald Trump personalities. Yeah,
exactly. And so he fears. The Russians fear Trump. And this is why they would have never done, and they didn't do it when he was in power, because he understood Russia, pursued the most robust policy against them, and he was maligned by all these, bureaucrats and the spy chiefs that instead of tracking U.S. threats to the United States, they're tracking, people like Carter Page, right? U.S. citizen. They are trying to put pressure on Twitter and Facebook to censor content. I mean, it's it's crazy what's going on. That's what they do. That's of course they don't have time to track real threats. Like, when would they?
Yeah. Rebekah, can you explain what is a useful idiot?
Oh, sure. Yes. Okay.
That's a strategy too of Putin's.
Right. Well, if there's if you find a useful idiot in the dictionary, that's probably like a picture of Adam Schiff, right? So all jokes aside, so what useful idiot is, it's a person who unwittingly helps propagate Russia's worldview and Russia's point of view and Russia's policy. Okay, how does that happen? So the Russians' targeting strategy is quite nuanced and very sophisticated, right? They wouldn't be trying to convert like you and me, right, and make us sympathetic to Putin, but they would be trying to convert people who are predisposed, towards socialism. They're predisposed to believe things that are not true. Like I mentioned, actually, Adam Schiff, but President Biden probably would be an even more appropriate candidate for being a useful idiot. These are the people who can be easily manipulated. Remember when Putin authorized the deployment of 190,000 troops, all but encircling Ukraine, right? He didn't just do it in one day. He didn't just invade, on the 24th and he got everything ready on the 23rd. He was doing it in gradually over the course of the month, while at the same time he was pursuing a negotiating strategy. He was trying to convince, and he did convince the Biden administration that Russia was genuinely getting ready to negotiate the so-called security guarantees. The truth is that both sides knew that it was a no-go because the positions were so irreconcilable, and yet President Biden had the propensity to just get entangled in these negotiations, similar as like the reset, right? The reset, when he was the vice president, he was the one who was pursuing the policy of reset, and he was in charge of the Ukraine portfolio. And another example is President Obama, right? Remember how Putin managed to convince President Obama that Russia was going to take out the weapons, the chemical weapons out of Syria. That was a psychological operation. So basically, that is the useful idiot who, usually it's unwittingly. That's why they're useful. They're idiots because they don't understand the true goal, and they don't understand the personality and what's driving it. And they just kind of promote the foreign adversary's goal and hurt their own country because of their idiocy, because they're not able to grasp reality.
Yeah. You jumped ahead and answered the question before I asked it. So I was going to ask you if you believe that any of these presidents were useful idiot. President Bush, President Obama, President Trump, and President Biden. I think you've already spoke a little bit about Obama and Biden, but what about President Bush, President Trump?
Well, President Bush, as much as it pains me to say, President Bush was, and maybe it wasn't his fault necessarily, because president depends on other advisors, and you might know that Bob Gates, the former CIA director, and Condoleezza Rice, the so-called Russia expert, just penned an op-ed in the Washington Post, right? Well, nobody, they had their chance, right? It's actually on their watch that a lot of these things happened. They were very senior officials and they didn't do what needed to be done. And that is a robust deterrence strategy. So instead, she did not advise, President Bush not to believe Putin, right? Because he was a KGB agent. She tried to convince him to pursue this reset strategy, and how, the Russians would help us with counterterrorism operations, because, this is what Bush wanted to believe, because we were attacked on September 11th, and he was looking for allies. And Putin, of course, he's a KGB. He placed a call, to George Bush, and he said, how Russia, will do everything to help the United States and all that. And Bush believed all of that, of course. So when it comes to, yes, Bush, Obama, and Biden, definitely useful idiots. When it comes to President Trump, President Trump, I don't think he was a useful idiot. He learned very quickly. Like in the beginning, he was, I must say, in my assessment, was on the path to become a useful idiot. Why do I say that? Because President Trump also originally thought that a reset was possible, and he wanted to engage the Russians on counterterrorism. How do I know this? I was actually I was being interviewed for a very senior position in the Trump administration in the Pentagon, right? And the interviewer's questions led me to believe that they were looking for somebody who would be on board with sharing intelligence with the Russians when it comes to counterterrorism operations, and having somebody who would be on board with having the Russians help us, right? Truly help us in Syria. And I said, no, it's just, and I basically regurgitated the chapter in my book that says, why can't Russia and US can never be friends. And so yes, but then once President Trump started receiving those, top secret briefings, his PDBs, I believe that he quickly understood what was possible and what wasn't possible. And he understood Putin's true character and what his goal was. And that's when we saw Trump authorizing the strike in Syria. That's when we saw Trump kicking out Kaspersky software. And it's true that Trump never offended Putin like verbally, right? But what's the purpose? Once you start, because Putin is not afraid of words. Okay, Biden said, Putin is a killer. This man can no longer remain in power. But Putin is not afraid of words. Putin is afraid of actions, and the actions that Trump took put the fear of God into Putin, and this is why he never dared to do anything like that, like invading Ukraine. It's very simple. So no, President Trump was not a useful idea.
Okay. Now we know they've interfered in our elections, but let's shift to our role in this war as well. First of all, did we ever interfere in Russian domestic issues and their elections?
Well, of course we did. It's a standard tradecraft, right? This is realpolitik, and we do this routinely, not in the same manner, right? We do it differently. But the United States believes that democracy is the best system in the world, the most fair and just system, and we want everybody to be just like us. And so we have the International Republican Institute, we have the IRI, and what's the other? We have its counterpart, the Democratic. The National Endowment for Democracy, something like that. So there are these think tanks, right, that regularly operate, not just in Russia, but in other countries, and where we try to prop up the dissent, the opposition to the current regime. And so during Hillary Clinton, obviously, when she was the head of the State Department, we all know what happened in Ukraine in 2014. So we tried to, and it's all on the record, right? The Russians actually intercepted her, one of her senior officials in the State Department phone call, Victoria Nuland, with the head of the EU. And so they admitted that they wanted to change regime in Kiev. So yes, we do interfere in their elections. We believe it's for the good cause. They do it for the bad cause. Ultimately, it's all realpolitik. Both sides know this. The only difference is that all Russians know that Russia conducts disinformation, right? And so the Russian people kind of they acknowledge it. They're not deceived. Unfortunately, the American people have no idea that our own spy services conduct, and the whole, government apparatus conducts disinformation. The whole thing about the Russia-Ukraine war, right? That it's we are being told that it's to help democracy in Ukraine. Well, that's a bunch of nonsense because Ukraine is not a democracy. Ukraine is a highly corrupt, the most corrupt country in Europe. It's 123rd out of 180 on the corruption scale. I mean, Zelensky is not a democratic leader. He's as much of a dictator as Putin. I mean, he outlawed all oppositions. He's targeting, media. There's one party line media environment right now in Ukraine. He's targeting Russian Orthodox churches, hunting for Putin's spies and this sort of thing. But none of this gets to the average American, right? So if the Biden administration admitted, and not just the Biden, but the Washington establishment just simply admitted, said, and what is the reason why we're doing what we're doing in Ukraine? I think most American people probably would understand. But now they've dug themselves into a situation where Ukraine is becoming Afghanistan 2.0, and they can't get out of it because they've gone too far. And it's a disaster because it's the U.S. taxpayer that bears the burden of this conflict. It's another endless war that we are in. All the way in, and Biden is asking us to continue helping for as long as needed. Never mind the nuclear Armageddon that he said that it's potentially gonna escalate to. So it's a mess. Like, there's no logic to these people's policies, unfortunately.
So why are we in Ukraine? Why are we fighting a proxy war in Ukraine?
So here's why we are fighting this war. Just like Putin wants his security perimeter, we want ours, right? And by we, I mean NATO. The U.S. is the leading partner in NATO, and we want to protect the allies, because the assessment is that if you let Putin, take a finger, he'll chop off the entire arm, right? You let him win in Ukraine, the next will be Baltics and Poland. And so, but there are two problems with this assessment. First, I already addressed, right? It's inconceivable that Putin will go after the Baltics. That would trigger Article 5 collective defense, where NATO will be legally justified to just, go and squash Russia. Okay. Putin is not suicidal. There's no plan. I'm telling you, and I've written a book where I predicted this conflict. So I would have written to you in the book what, if he had such plans. So this intelligence assessment is flawed. Putin is not, but that's what we're basing it on. And the second problem with this goal is that the Europeans themselves are not willing to contribute for their own defense. They are willing to use Ukrainians as cannon fodder. And with all the moral lecturing that is out there, right? Putin is a monster, which he is, right? And we are on the right side and we're protecting democracy. I mean, how immoral that 100,000 Ukrainians are now dead or injured just on the military side, and another 20 to 40,000 of civilians. And we are protecting, Poland and all these other ones who are not. Well, Poland is contributing its fair share, as Obama would say. But Germany is the largest economy in Europe, and they're not even providing 2%. Okay. And then, so that's the problem. And then the final real reason is we want to degrade Russia militarily and economically. by fighting this war and providing more and more sophisticated weaponry. But the problem with that justification is that we are eroding our own military capability. According to Raytheon CEO, we have already provided to Ukraine 13 years worth of Stinger missiles in less than 1 year. This operation hasn't been going on for 1 year just yet. And 5 years worth of javelins, okay? And our military industrial complex does not have the production capacity to ramp up these weapon systems fast enough. And so what happens if China decides to use military force to establish control over Taiwan, which I believe will happen during Biden's term, hopefully first and only term, right? When Putin and Xi met in February, it is my assessment that there was an agreement that if Putin were to be on the path to lose, not just tactically, but which he is right now, but not strategically. So if he were on the path to lose, then Xi would start military incursion into Taiwan and would challenge the U.S. in a two-theater war. And the U.S. military is not capable right now. We have the doctrine, but we don't have right now the military readiness, the combat readiness, because we are focused on pronouns, right? The Pentagon is. The recent report by the Heritage Foundation stipulates very clearly that we are in the red when it comes to certain weapon systems and combat readiness. I mean, the hypersonic weapon systems is just one example. And that is the problem with that justification. So all around, the reasons for us fighting this endless war, and believe me, it will become endless, it will become Afghanistan, is a huge problem, and they just don't see it right now.
Yeah, but Rebekah, how can that even be? I mean, we are spending 2023 over $800 billion for our military budget. In 2022, $700+ billion, 4% roughly of GDP. Russia's spending, I think in 2023, 86 or so billion dollars, 4% of their GDP. But I mean, the amount of military spend the US incurs versus a country like Russia, I mean, we just dwarf them. So how is it that we are at risk of losing?
How are we at risk of losing if a war were to break out between Russia? It's very simple, Tamara, because it's not going to be a conventional war. Okay. Because they always viewed themselves quite realistically as conventionally inferior. And this is why a very special nuclear doctrine was developed by the General Staff on Putin's orders called escalate to de-escalate, whereby a tactical nuclear warhead would be detonated in the theater, such as Ukraine. A low yield is under 1 kiloton, between 1 and like 15, but the Russians favor sub-kiloton. So, for example, compare it, and they have justified it, right? They've pointed the finger to the United States. They said, look, the US, you're the ones who dropped nukes on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan, the fat man and the little boy, and within less than a year, these two cities came back to life, right? They were never abandoned, right? They never, it wasn't devastating to Japan. In fact, Japan right now is our ally, and that's their justification. What they want to do is they want to stave off U.S. deployment into the theater, and they want to stop the provision of military hardware. So if that were to start the nuclear conflict, the Russians right now have advantage in tactical nukes, 1-10 ratio with us. We have 200, they have 2,000, right? And it's not going to be like, hopefully, it's not going to be like a real Armageddon where we'd have strategic nukes flying, but across the ocean. And that is why cyber comes in. Cyber, the Russians view cyber as a weapon of mass destruction on par with nuclear, except without creating a nuclear mushroom. And the Russians have been preparing the battlefield, so to speak, for the past 20 years. We just discussed, about Moonlight Maze cyber operation, but since then, the Russians consistently have targeted the US, including our critical infrastructure. And, every agency practically was penetrated by the Russians, from the White House to the Pentagon to the State Department, including nuclear facilities. You remember they've targeted the gas supply, the strategic, reserves, gas, food industry. So they've been mapping out access. And so when it comes to it, if the conflict is actually becomes like a direct shooting war between Russia and the US, Russians are prepared to win. And that's why my book is called Putin's Playbook, Russia's Secret Plan to Defeat America. The nuance is that they're not going to deploy, they don't do, there's no plan to like invade the US, put boots on the ground just because. It's because they want to prevent us from encroaching upon their strategic security perimeter. So they routinely fly, strategic bombers, breaching actually the IDs, the air identification zone. They've practiced all of it. They sent submarines close to our coast, and Russian subs are very, very quiet. In fact, back when I was an intelligence officer, the Russians, we couldn't see the Russian subs like for weeks until they actually left. They were close to a U.S. coast, without naming which specific one. So there's a plan. And this is why, because it's not all about money. I mean, it's apples and oranges to compare the two budgets because of the purchasing power parity. It's apples and oranges.
Yeah. So how do you see this war in Ukraine ending?
I don't think it's going to end. This is going to become an endless war. I think at minimum for another, I would say 2 to 5 years, right? Here's the reason. So the Russians, as I said, they view the outcome as existential, not just for Putin himself, but for Russia. It's like we said, it's a Monroe Doctrine. Putin staked his entire presidential career and his legacy on this war, in addition to the fact that they view Ukraine as part of their strategic buffer, right? And it's the same on the other side, right? There's no exit strategy for us because we've been increasing the scope and scale of weapon systems that we're providing. What started off with blankets and night vision goggles during the Obama, and then President Trump started providing actually lethal aid. Now we've progressed to systems that would have been, unthinkable to authorize to provide to someone that is not even a NATO member. We're talking about strategic systems like the Patriot missile defense, and now the Bradley combat vehicles. And once we're in, the more at this point, we can't back out. We can't back out because that would be perceived as handing victory to Putin, and which would definitely embolden him. And when it comes to Zelensky, he is also feeling very emboldened. He had this outstanding performance in front of Congress, asking for more money, and he got it. And the guy's an actor. Remember, he's a very, very talented politician. He has upstaged Putin, if you will, in the propaganda department. I mean, he's surrounded by consultants, Western and especially U.S. consultants. Why do you think he's wearing this military, style uniform, even to Congress, right? Which some Americans found disrespectful. It's the image. He's the wartime president. It's the same people. Remember when Putin was elected the person of the year, right, by the Time magazine and some of the other outfits in U.S. media. Why did that happen? It's the consultants, right? It's the same. Putin had PR agencies working for him, American PR agencies, okay, who helped them place, op-eds in the New York Times, right? New York Times was the one that published his famous op-ed in September that worked.
Yeah, our media is culpable in all of this.
Oh, of course. Yes.
All of this.
And so all of these three sides right now are postured for escalation, and there's no exit strategy. And that's why it's going to be it's not going to be there's no end in sight. Basically, if anything, it will be the bloodiest yet. 2013 will be a bloodbath, and we already have seen the preview to it, in the first couple of weeks. And that is just going to continue. Putin is going to ratchet up missile bombardment to destroy as much of Ukraine as possible, because he already understood that we are not going to allow him to establish control over Ukraine. And so there's a Russian saying that you might know, and Ukrainian also, so which means if I can't have it, you cannot have it either. And so he's destroying right now not only military, but civilian infrastructure, not only to freeze Ukraine and deprive them of drinking water and electricity, but also to raise the cost of rebuilding for the US, right? To make it harder for BlackRock. And BlackRock right now is already, posturing. Your former brethren at on Wall Street, right? They all
Larry Fink is nuzzling up. Yeah.
Yep, they're all hovering over it. And so it's the biggest, transfer of wealth, this conflict in history, because whose stocks are now rising, right? It's the Raytheon, it's the Lockheed Martin, and the money that regular, ordinary Americans are sacrificing for Ukraine, that the IRS agents are targeting, is now ending up in the coffers of US and Western consultants, right? The trainers, the image builders, as well as the military industrial complex. And just like in Afghanistan, hopefully it won't take 20 years, hopefully maybe 5 will be enough, but at least for 5 years, I don't see this conflict ending.
Okay. And how does it end? Do you think that it's going to be a takedown of Putin? Do you think that Putin is actually sick, like they're reporting, and he dies? Or, how do you think this ends?
Okay, so first, Putin is not dying. I know that the chief of Ukrainian intelligence just recently said that Putin has an illness and he will die and we will prevail. None of it is true. Putin will not die because he does not have a terminal illness at this time. Okay, it's all propaganda. Ukrainians are just as good at psychological operations as the Russians and the US. And so the intelligence assessment on Putin's health is that while we do not rule out the possibility that Putin has an underlying health condition, he is not about to kick the bucket. Okay, it's under control. So there's no evidence of him having Parkinson's. There's no evidence of him having terminal cancer with terminal being the key word here. This being said, it's extremely difficult to assess with high accuracy Putin's health. Why? It's because the guy is paranoid to the point where he has his excrement, his pee and poop collected by his security detail when he travels, in order for it not to fall into the hands of Western intelligence services, because our pee and poop, as we know, can tell a lot about our health. So no Western doctor has ever examined Putin. So again, that being said, it's there's no intelligence right now indicating that he is will either step down or it will be a regime collapse. It's wishful thinking. So the way that it will likely end, it will be frozen. And we have such examples. So Putin has annexed the 4 territories, right? Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. And Crimea, he annexed in 2014. So Putin is going to try to keep control over those. The fighting is going to continue, and now it's escalating. So we know that Ukrainians were able to recapture some of the territories that the Russians occupied. But nevertheless, they still occupy between 18 and 20%. And so Putin wants that part recognized by the international community. And even if we don't, he's going to act as though he does. And so there will continue to be fighting, low intensity operations, typical frozen conflict. We have those in other places, like, there's one in Moldova, there's one in Georgia, there's kind of one in Syria right now, though we don't call it a frozen conflict, but there are ongoing operations. And so everybody's forgotten about it. So what Putin is hoping is that Americans will forget about this soon and will stop providing the aid, and then he could either have his services assassinate Zelensky and remove him from power and install his own puppet regime, or he can come to some sort of settlement with the West, whereby he keeps, half of Ukraine and the other half. I don't mean half, like he keeps the part that he has annexed. It's kind of like a North-South Korea situation. So that is my forecast for that one.
This is a very important book. I want everyone to go out and read it. It is a true warning to all Americans that they really need to understand what we're dealing with as a threat to our democracy. And Rebekah, where do they buy the book and how do they find you?
Sure. The book is sold anywhere, in Barnes and Nobles or any other store where you buy books, and of course on Amazon, any of the websites. I have a website, RebekahKoffler.com. I'm on Twitter and Getter, and now on Truth Social as well. My handle is Rebekah, REBEKAH 0132. It's been such a pleasure to be on your podcast, Tamara. I hope that 2023 will become the year when Americans finally realize that our freedom is now threatened, and we do everything possible to prevent the Bolsheviks from turning USA into USSR 2.0. And we elect the right leaders who will instill the fear of God into our adversaries and not play as useful idiots as some of them were before.
Yes. Rebekah, thank you so much. This was very insightful. I truly appreciate your time, and thank you for all the work that you do.
Thank you, Tamara. Likewise. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.